Peter, our biggest borrowing offshore in Australia comes from our banks, and they're getting squeezed in terms of their offshore borrowing. Have you thought of overseas funds to invest in our bank loans?
Well, we, about 3.5 years ago, wasn't so much a fund, but talked to investors about a strategy where we would be exclusively owning bank debt, and we had quite a number of clients who were quite interested in doing that. I guess that sort of waxes and wanes with offshore investors' view of our banks. And one thing you'd have to say at the moment is that there's quite a wide difference of opinion between Australian investors' view of our banks and offshore investors' views, and it's largely got to do with what you think is going to happen with the Australian property market. Even my colleagues in the US, and I've got one out here with me at the moment, looks at the Australian property market and says it's the most overvalued property market in the world. It's a serious bubble. Now, that's not necessarily the view of us here in Australia, not just because we own Australian property. They're looking at all sorts of different metrics that they use to standardise property markets around the world, and say that they think Australia is is seriously overvalued in the residential space.
So, in terms of Australian banks trying to borrow to fund their wholesale portfolios, they're caught in this crossfire where the overseas people just don't like the look of the Australian bank balance sheets and are very reluctant to invest in Australian bank debt unless there's a very high rate.
Well, yeah, but also there's a lot of competition for bank funding around the world at the moment as well. So it's not just Australian. Australian banks are competing with all sorts of other banks in all parts of the world. But you're right. There is an emerging view that because Australian banks, the big four Australian banks, are so tightly levered into the domestic property market that if there was to be some more severe correction in the property market, that may have an impact on bank balance sheets.
But the problem is that the global investors are worried about the Australian property market, which means they're worried about Australian banks.
Correct. Now, it's interesting that you say that because most Australian banks, the average LVR across their RMBS portfolios is still in the 50s. So, there could be quite a significant fall in Australian property prices before we'd really see any severe impact there. But it's the perception that counts at the moment, and there's certainly that perception.